Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. I've just been catching up on a little rest down here. Why don't you join me? Just kick back, relax, and enjoy the next installment of the Curator's Crypt. We've all seen those old Hollywood movies with mummies stalking their victims across a haunted landscape. But you might be surprised to know that these tales of reanimated ancient mummies don't date back to ancient Egypt so much as to the mid-19th century, in particular to Edgar Allan Poe's 1845 story, Some Words of the Mummy. This is the first printing right here from the American Review. And this is the second printing of Some Words of the Mummy from the November 1st, 1845 issue of the Broadway Journal. So Poe thought this was a good enough story that he very quickly reprinted it. In fact, the first time he sold the story to the Columbian magazine, he didn't think he got enough money for it, so he got it back and then sold it again to the American Review where it first appeared. So Poe at least attached some significance to this story. And Some Words of the Mummy is the tale of some scientists who got together to have a mummy unwrapping party, which is just what it sounds like. The scientists got really drunk, they got a mummy, you could buy mummies back then, and they unwrapped the mummy to see what was underneath it. And this is really something that they did back in Poe's time. And after the scientists had unwrapped the mummy, they found that the skin was very flexible. They saw that its organs, its brain, had not been removed. So they said, hey, I wonder what happens if we hook it up to a battery, to a voltaic pile, and they hooked it up to a battery and shocked the mummy back to life. So this became the first fictional account of a reanimated mummy walking in modern times. But Poe didn't play it for horror, he played it for comedy. He thought that this was a good way to critique the people of the 19th century. So it combines elements of science fiction, elements of comedy, maybe a little bit of horror there. But Poe is tapping into the world around him to really Egypt mania. The Rosetta Stone had been discovered in Egypt back in 1799, so 10 years before Poe was born. And for the first time, this allowed the modern world to decipher hieroglyphics and to really start learning about ancient Egypt. And the Western world's fascinated by this. You start to see Egyptian revival style furniture and clothing. You saw poems written to mummies, like Address to the Mummy at Belzani's exhibition from 1821 by Horace Smith, The Memphian Mummy, 1833 by William Hosmer, Ode to a Female Mummy, a love poem to a mummy, Opening the Mummy, 1853 by Benjamin Shalaber. This was just a whole trend in people really interested in all things mummy. Even in theater, you could go see The Mummy, 1833 by William Bernard, or The Virginia Mummy, 1835 by T.D. Rice, which is about an Egyptologist who was obsessed with trying to use a battery to shock a mummy back to life. So you can see all around you. But Théophile Gautier, the French writer in 1840, he even wrote The Mummy's Foot, a short story about a mummy's foot. It's about a guy who went to an antique store, and you could do this back then. He found a mummy's foot and he bought it. And then that night he went home, he had a dream that the mummy came to him and said, I want my foot back. And he said, okay, I'll make you a deal. I'll give you your foot back if you give me a little Egyptian statuette in return. So when he woke up in the morning, the foot was gone and he had a little statuette. So that's the kind of stories and poems that were out there in Poe's day. But in addition to mummies in fashion and furniture and fiction, you could even get medicine made of ground up mummies. there were so many mummies being looted from Egypt, brought back here, they're grinding up and using them for fuel or for medicine. And it didn't stop there. They made entire buildings inspired by Egyptian architecture. Americans' fascination with all things Egypt extended to entire buildings, like the Egyptian building here at VCU, built in 1844, that was designed to look like an ancient Egyptian temple. Even the fence is made of iron mummies. Check out the bottom here. You can even see his toes sticking out the bottom. And when Poe was growing up, he actually got to see a mummy. Now, this is the Virginia State Capitol right here, and Poe at the time was living right over here with his foster parents, so really only 2 blocks away. He was 14 years old, and it was announced that opening on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the old Senate chamber at the Capitol, where our Senate was meeting at the time, was being used to display a mummy. You could go see it for 25 cents. You get season tickets for just 50 cents. So it's really difficult to imagine Poe not taking advantage of the opportunity to go see this mummy on display, and maybe at that early age becoming fascinated with mummies. But what about this other element of the story? Shocking bodies back to life. Well, it's something that they were experimenting on down here at the old Virginia State Penitentiary. They were experimenting on dead bodies, shocking them with electricity to see if they'd move or maybe come back to life. Now, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that was years earlier, back in 1818, but people were still trying to find ways to conquer death. There's even a report that a man had been shocked back to life after having been dead for 100 years. Of course, this was just a hoax, but this is what was in the newspapers back then, and this is maybe what inspired Poe in part to write his reanimation story. So Poe's story concludes with the mummy, who they call Allamistakio, just deriding people of the 19th century, saying that their technology is inferior, that nobody in the 19th century in America could ever create one of these great pyramids or temples that the Egyptians did so easily. And people in Poe's day thought the Egyptians had all sorts of lost technology. How do they build these great buildings? How do they preserve bodies to last for thousands of years? They even thought that the ancient Egyptians had invented electric batteries and steam engines. So here this mummy is just ridiculing people of the 19th century, and the best those men in the 19th century can do is just say, well, we dress better than you guys did. And the mummy just shakes his head. He looks at their strange clothes, and they said, well, at least we've got really good laxatives. And that's when the mummy just gives up. That, yeah, sure, in the 19th century they got better laxatives. But this goes along with something Poe is writing about at just about the same time he wrote this story. In a letter to James Russell Lowell, he said that we're still very primitive. We think that we've advanced so far, but we really haven't. He said, I have no faith in human perfectibility. I think that human exertion will have no appreciable effect upon humanity. Man is now only more active, not more happy nor more wise than he was 6,000 years ago. So Poe had kind of a grim view of our illusions that we've somehow advanced beyond the people of the past, and he thought that really a lot of the great technologies, a lot of the great thoughts, they've been lost long ago. So I hope you'll take the time now to read or reread Poe's mummy story, Some Words of the Mummy, and see how it might have impacted some of the later mummy stories by Bram Stoker or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and eventually inspired a whole horror subgenre of mummy films. But thanks for joining us this week at the Poe Museum's Curator's Crypt.